I had been living with my uncle for about a year. He was in the military, which meant he was often away for long periods, sometimes months at a time. During those stretches, I missed him deeply, but he always made an effort to stay connected, whether it was through quick letters, short phone calls, or even surprise postcards from distant places. He ensured I felt loved and cared for, like a daughter to him. His protective and kind nature always reassured me, and I felt safe knowing he was looking out for me even from afar. First, I didn't give much thought to his absences. It was just part of the routine. He would leave, and I would count down the days until his return. But this time was different. He had been away for 3 whole months, and I found myself more eager than ever for him to come back. He had promised he would visit as soon as he returned, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. My days were filled with anticipation, eagerly crossing off dates on the calendar and imagining what it would be like to see him again. However, as the weeks dragged on, my excitement began to shift into something more complicated. It wasn't just the usual happiness and relief I felt when he came home. There was a strange tension in my chest that I couldn't quite put into words. The thought of his return stirred a confusing mix of emotions inside me. Excitement, yes, but also nervousness. It was as if my heart knew something my mind hadn't figured out yet. Every time I imagined him walking through the door, my pulse quickened, and a flutter of nerves coursed through me. It wasn't just the anticipation of seeing him. It was something deeper. His name carried a weight when spoken, and the thought of his presence filled my mind with an intensity one didn't understand. I found myself replaying memories of him over and over, fixating on little details, the sound of his laugh, the warmth in his voice, the way he used to ruffle my hair in jest. It was confusing and overwhelming. I didn't know why this time felt so different. Was it because I had missed him more than usual? Or was something else changing within me? These thoughts consumed me, leaving me restless and unable to shake the feeling that something was different this time. A few days before his return, a letter arrived unexpectedly. The sight of his familiar handwriting on the envelope made my heart race. I carefully opened it, my hands trembling slightly, and read the simple message inside. It was short, just a few lines, but his words struck me deeply. He wrote about how much he missed me, how he had been thinking of me constantly, and how he couldn't wait to come home and see me. I read the letter over and over, trying to absorb the meaning behind his words. There was something about the way he wrote them, gentle yet heartfelt, that made my heart flutter in a way I hadn't anticipated. His words seemed so ordinary on the surface, but the emotion behind them felt different, deeper, almost as if there was something unsaid lingering between the lines. I couldn't stop wondering about it. Was it just his usual affection? Or was there a layer of meaning I wasn't picking up on? I wanted to dismiss it as overthinking, but the thought wouldn't leave me alone. His words felt so personal, so intimate, that I began to see him in a way I never had before. It made me question everything. Finally, the day of his return arrived. As his car pulled into the driveway, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I ran out to meet him, a mixture of joy and nerves swirling inside me. When I saw him step out of the car, he looked different, more confident, more handsome than I remembered. His smile lit up his face as he opened his arms for a hug, and I rushed into them without hesitation. The hug felt different too. His arms wrapped around me tightly, and I could feel the strength in his embrace. It was warm and comforting, but also overwhelming in a way I couldn't explain. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. His scent, earthy and familiar, brought back a flood of memories. But there was something about the way he held me that made my heart race. Felt good, but also confusing, like there was an undercurrent of something I wasn't ready to face. When he pulled back, he looked at me with an intensity that made my cheeks flush. "You've grown," he said softly, his voice carrying an affectionate tone. "And you're very nice looking." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my face heat up. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply smiled and looked away, trying to mask the swirl of emotions his comment had stirred. That evening, we had dinner together, just the two of us. The house felt quieter than usual, the air thick with an unspoken tension. I tried to focus on our conversation, but every glance he threw my way made my heart skip a beat. His gaze lingered longer than it used to, and I couldn't ignore the way it made me feel, both nervous and strangely exhilarated. Later, we sat on the porch under a blanket of stars. The night was cool and still, and his voice broke the silence as he started sharing stories about his time in the military. He spoke of distant lands, challenging missions, and the camaraderie he had built with his comrades. His words painted vivid pictures, and I found myself captivated by his stories. Yet, even as he spoke, I couldn't ignore the way his eyes seemed to focus on me, studying me as if I were the only person in the world. That gaze, it made my skin prickle with awareness, as though he could see right through me. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to handle the weight of his attention. It felt like a line had been crossed, but I couldn't tell where or how. All I knew was that something had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what that meant. My heart began to race, the steady rhythm of my pulse quickening in an unsettling way. It wasn't the type of attention I was accustomed to receiving from him. Normally, he would shift his gaze elsewhere, perhaps focusing on the stars or something far off in the distance, never lingering too long on me. But tonight, something felt different. His eyes were locked on me, piercing through the silence, studying me with an intensity one had never experienced before. It wasn't the casual glance or the mild disinterest I was used to. No, this time it felt like he was analyzing every inch of me, scrutinizing my every move, and it made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I couldn't figure out why he was looking at me this way, or what it meant, but it unsettled me. It was as though something was shifting in the air between us, something unspoken, yet undeniable. I didn't know how to process it. The usual ease I felt around him was replaced with an overwhelming sense of discomfort. As I tried to look away, pretending not to notice his gaze, the feeling of being under his scrutiny lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake it. His eyes stayed on me, and every moment seemed to stretch longer, pulling me deeper into my unease. As the evening wore on and the air grew colder, the room felt quieter, almost too quiet. The usual hum of conversation had faded into an oppressive stillness, and the silence between my uncle and me seemed to thicken, filling the space with something I couldn't quite name. He moved a little closer to me, and I felt the tension rise, like the air just before a storm, pregnant with anticipation, though I had no idea for what. His presence felt so close now, his proximity palpable. I could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle shift of his movements, every sound he made echoing in my ears. Without a word, he reached out and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. The instant his skin made contact with mine, I felt a shock, an electric jolt that ran through my entire body. It was as though the touch was charged with something powerful, something beyond my understanding. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel it hammering loudly in my chest. It was as if my whole being had responded to him in that single moment. I froze, not knowing how to react. Part of me wanted to pull away, to escape the intensity of the situation, but another part of me was rooted to the spot, unsure of what the touch meant. The tension in my body was palpable, yet there was an odd comfort in his touch too, a strange contradiction that left me feeling disoriented and confused. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, one that was both unsettling and somehow reassuring at the same time. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside me. I couldn't figure out why it felt like everything in me was being pulled in two directions, one part of me wanting to stay close, to remain in the moment, and the other part wanting to run as far away as possible. But instead of acting on either impulse, I stayed still, caught in the web of confusion that seemed to grow more tangled by the second. The days that followed were filled with an awkward, unfamiliar tension. I noticed my uncle watching me, his gaze lingering a little too long, and every time our eyes met, he would offer a small, knowing smile. I couldn't help but feel unsettled. Why was I reacting this way? He was my uncle, and these feelings I was experiencing, weren't they wrong? Wasn't it unnatural to feel this strange pull toward him? One evening, the house was quiet, and my uncle and I found ourselves alone together. We had both been drinking. The the warm glow of alcohol mingling with the awkwardness in the air. We were laughing, sharing stories, when suddenly, my uncle stopped. His expression shifted, and his eyes grew serious, almost too intense. "You've changed," he said softly. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "You're more beautiful than I remember." My heart fluttered in my chest, and I could feel a sudden heat rising to my cheeks. He leaned in closer, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, the distance between us shrinking until it seemed there was no space left at all. "I've missed you," he whispered, his words sending a shiver down my spine. I froze. My body felt like it was betraying me, responding to his proximity and his words in a way I couldn't control. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the strange, unsettling desire that was slowly building inside me. I knew this wasn't right, but I couldn't stop it. The next day, my uncle sat me down. His demeanor was different, more serious than I had ever seen before. There was a tension in the air, a sense of urgency that made my stomach twist. His eyes locked with mine, intense and unwavering. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been thinking about you a lot while I've been away, and I want you to understand. I have certain desires." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was a whirlpool of confusion. Part of me wanted to run, to escape the growing intensity of the situation. But another part of me, despite everything I knew was wrong, felt drawn to him, unable to break away from the pull. That evening, once again, we were alone. The house was eerily quiet, as if the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of us. He stood in front of me, his gaze soft but penetrating. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath becoming shallow, as if the very act of breathing was difficult. When he leaned in closer, I didn't know what to expect, but before I could process it, his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was hesitant, almost tentative, but it sent a shockwave through me. It was so unexpected, so unfamiliar. Yet in that moment, it felt like everything had changed. My world shifted, and for a brief second, I forgot everything else. But just as quickly, reality set in. I pulled away, my face burning with shame and confusion. What had I just done? Why had I kissed him back? My heart was racing, and I could barely understand what had happened. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I tried to make sense of what had just occurred. I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze, overwhelmed with guilt and confusion. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice softer than before, he spoke. "Don't be sorry," he said, his words lingering in the space between us. "I've been wanting this for so long." A chill ran through me as his words sank in. I didn't know what to say, and the silence stretched out between us, thick with unspoken emotions. His gaze was steady, unrelenting, and it made me feel simultaneously comforted and uneasy. The following days were filled with a new kind of awkwardness. I tried to avoid him, not knowing how to act, how to handle the situation. But every time our eyes met, there was a silent understanding between us, something unspoken that neither of us could deny. Late one night, I found myself alone with my thoughts, unable to stop thinking about him, about what had happened, the way his touch had felt. The kiss we had shared, it haunted me, a constant presence in my mind that I couldn't escape. I knew it was wrong, but a part of me couldn't shake the pull I felt toward him. And when he found me sitting alone, lost in my thoughts, he sat next to me, taking my hand in his. "You don't have to hide from me," he said, his voice gentle. "I want you to understand that I care about you more than you know." I looked at him, my heart thundering in my chest. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I feel anymore." The words escaped me before I could stop them, a confession that I wasn't sure I was ready to make. But it had been building up inside me for days. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he reached out, cupping my face in his hands, gently tilting my chin so that I had no choice but to meet his eyes. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver through me. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Just know that I want to be with you, no matter what." His words, so simple yet so powerful, made my heart ache with a mixture of relief and confusion. The following day, we found ourselves alone once more. The house felt unusually quiet, the silence almost oppressive. There was an unspoken tension hanging between us, thick and heavy, like a storm was brewing. I couldn't quite understand why, but a part of me felt drawn to him in a way that I couldn't ignore. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me closer to him, even though my mind wasn't sure if it was right. Before I could fully process my thoughts, he closed the distance between us. His presence enveloped me, filling every inch of space in the room. This time, when his lips met mine, everything changed. The kiss was no longer tentative. It was powerful, deep, and urgent. His touch was insistent, as though he was trying to communicate something to me without words. As his lips pressed against mine, I felt my pulse quicken, my heart racing in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. It was overwhelming, like a wave crashing over me, drowning everything else in its wake. I couldn't think. I didn't know how to respond, but I didn't want to pull away either. Without thinking, I kissed him back, surrendering to the moment, letting it carry me along. His hands moved to touch me, and I couldn't help but shiver. His touch was a strange mix of tenderness and strength, sending a cascade of emotions flooding through me: fear, excitement, confusion, desire, all swirling together in a whirlwind I wasn't prepared for. I didn't understand what was happening or why I wasn't stopping it. My mind screamed for me to pull back, to say something, anything, to put an end to this madness. But my body didn't listen. It was as if every part of me was alive in a way I'd never experienced before. And all that mattered in that moment was the overwhelming intensity of what we were sharing. My mind had become a blur, and I couldn't find the will to break free from it. The world around me seemed to fade into the background, until the only thing that existed was him, and the pulse of electricity that ran through me with every touch, every glance. It was as though I had lost all control, trapped in something I couldn't explain. A force greater than myself was pulling me further into it, and despite my confusion, I couldn't bring myself to resist. The days that followed were a blur. It felt as though time itself was slipping away, like I was living in a dream. My uncle and I spent more time together, and with each passing day, we grew closer. But this closeness brought with it something I hadn't expected, a sense of emotional turbulence that I couldn't navigate. It wasn't just about the physical connection. There was something deeper, something raw and unspoken, that we couldn't deny. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a shift in our relationship. It was no longer just about companionship or shared moments. It was something more complicated, more intimate. The bond we shared started to feel like it was crossing a line I didn't fully understand. I found myself caught between a deep sense of longing and an equally strong sense of guilt, as though I was walking on a tightrope between two worlds, one that felt intoxicatingly real, and the other that whispered warnings of danger. Every time we spent time together, I felt alive, more awake than I had ever been before. The simple act of being near him, of sharing a conversation or a laugh, made me feel as though I was seeing the world in vibrant colors for the first time. But at the same time, there was a gnawing feeling in my gut, a sense that something was wrong. I couldn't escape the growing sense of unease that followed me wherever I went. It was like my heart was being torn in two directions. On one side, I wanted to continue basking in the warmth of our connection, to explore whatever this was between us. On the other side, I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The more time we spent together, the more complicated everything seemed to become. I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I was crossing a line that I shouldn't have crossed, but I didn't know how to stop. My mind was in turmoil. I felt like I was walking through a storm, unsure of which direction to take. Part of me wanted to pull away, to take a step back and figure out what was happening inside me. But the other part of me couldn't bear the thought of losing the connection we had. I felt paralyzed, trapped in a cycle of emotions that I didn't understand. I couldn't figure out how to move forward or how to escape the pull he had on me. It was like I was caught in a vortex, spinning out of control. The more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel or what I was supposed to do. I was caught between two worlds, one where everything felt right and another where everything felt wrong. And I didn't know how to escape either. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update attractive, inspiring, and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue to develop. Thank you and see you in the next videos.